All right, hi. So I promised that I would record as short a video as I could manage. I'm talking about the context and history behind Jane Eyre. I am doing so in obviously a very casual fashion in an attempt to model what your Flipgrid videos can look like. And I am not in my office, but my husband's office, which is a little bit messier than mine, so please don't mind anything that's behind me. Okay, so Jane Eyre was published in 1847, and Charlotte Bronte published it under a pseudonym. She published it under the name Currer Bell, so that the name had the same initials, Charlotte Bronte, Currer Bell, CB were still the initials. And her two sisters, Anne Bronte and Emily Bronte, also published novels at the same time, also using pseudonyms. The reason why they did this was to try to obscure primarily their gender. In the names Acton, Ellis, and Currer Bell, they were striving to go for more androgynous names. And it was actually quite a debate in newspapers at the time over whether a man or a woman had written Jane Eyre. And it can be really fun to go back and read those reviews as people argued over a woman couldn't possibly have written this. Which I'm sure amused Charlotte Bronte very much. Women's writing was very often judged much more harshly and assessed differently than men's writing. So Charlotte Bronte wanted to be sure that the publishers that she was sending her manuscript to and her readers judged her on the same merits that they would judge the writing of a male author. This was the first novel that Charlotte Bronte published. The other novel she had tried to publish, called The Professor, had received 7 rejections before this one was published, and kind of a funny story was that she kept even using the same envelope that had like rejection stamps, or like the equivalent of rejection stamps on it as she sent it from publisher to publisher, which really wasn't a very bright idea for such a smart person to do. So that's why when you open the novel, you see that it says Jane Eyre, an autobiography, and then instead of Charlotte Bronte, you see Currer Bell listed as the author. In terms of why the book is called an autobiography, that is a really interesting convention that explains a lot about the history of fiction. Today in 2021, fiction and novels in particular are probably the most dominant form of literature that we're exposed to. But at this point, in the mid-19th century, novels were still relatively new to the scene. The century before, in the 1700s, there were very famous novelists like Daniel Defoe and Henry Fielding, but when they first started publishing, they weren't really sure how to market their works. They published them and pretended, when they were written in first person, that they were actually true, that they were autobiographies, instead of being, things that were made up. Instead of being made up narratives. And so this became a bit of a tradition, and that is what Charlotte Bronte was stepping into with Jane Eyre. Just like the debate over the gender of the author, a debate sometimes in the periodical press reigned on over whether this was an actual autobiography or a work of fiction. So Charlotte Bronte really did manage to confuse quite a lot of people with the publication of this book. I do have notes here that I'm going through, so that's what I'm looking at as I go back and forth. So to continue talking just briefly about kind of the history of the novel, this novel is very famous for a lot of reasons. But one of the most significant reasons why it's famous is because Charlotte Bronte has been called the first historian of the private consciousness, especially because she was one of the first people to really tell a story of someone from a young age, from childhood, all the way through, the first several decades of their life. This just wasn't something that was done. And she was really a pioneer in this fashion. And also the mode of what we now call psychological realism. This is not a fairy tale, even though there are fairy tale components we're going to talk about. This whole idea that you would tell a story in a very realistic kind of fashion, not just trying to tell the most kind of outlandish tale. Charlotte Bronte was certainly not the only person doing this. She's not the first person that contributed to this kind of movement, but this is certainly one of the earliest and most famous examples, which is how she earned that moniker, the first historian of the private consciousness. It was a literary scholar named David Burt who gave her that claim to fame. So I was talking a little bit about childhood and how Charlotte Bronte is one of the earliest people to really treat childhood as an important part of someone's life that deserves to be narrated. And it can be really hard to believe now because, we have child psychologists, we study education and how best to educate children. But the idea that childhood was a separate stage of life that deserved its own attention, and that children needed to be treated very differently from adults was a relatively new concept. It really wasn't until the end of the 17th century, about half a century or so before this book was written, that people began to take seriously the idea that childhood was a thing. And in class, I can show you a picture on Tuesday I'll gather some art to show you. If you look at pictures of little children in paintings, like paintings that are intended to be realistic, you see little kids' faces. They look almost exactly like adult faces. They're terrifying. It's just that they're in miniature little bodies, which really reflected the ideas about childhood at the time. So it wasn't until kind of the late 1700s that people started thinking, at least in the Western world, that people started thinking about childhood as something that needed to be studied and treated differently. And this novel is really a big part of our ability to study that trend. But there are some major downfalls to the fact that the idea of childhood was still relatively new, including the fact that there were not a lot of protections for children. So it'd be very easy to read this book and say, well, why didn't Mr. Lloyd go to Child Protective Services, once he realized that Jane was being abused at her home at Gateshead Hall? Guys, that just wasn't a thing. This is astonishing, but it wasn't until about 60 years after the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was founded in Britain that the same type of society was founded to protect children from abuse. And even then, that only happened because people who wanted to try to protect children, specifically a child who was being abused in London, that the child's neighbors were able to tell this was happening, went to people who were, were used to protecting animals who were being abused and said, how can we carry over some of these acts of protection and legislation and cultural awareness, and how can we, get that applied to children who are very vulnerable beings? So it was 1824 that the establishment of the Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals was established. A little bit after that, it became the Royal SPCA. It was after Queen Victoria took the crown in 1837, but you would see it either as the SPCA or the Royal SPCA. But it wasn't until 1883 that the equivalent organization was established to protect children. So that's why Mr. Lloyd didn't have anywhere to go. This novel was set primarily in the 1830s, and Jane's childhood is taking place even a little bit before that. So we're really only looking at the time where the protections against animals had just been established in England, let alone protections for children. And that's why, too, when when Bessie and Abbott, the maids and housekeepers, tell Jane that Mrs. Reed is doing her a favor, that her aunt's doing her a favor by keeping her at the house and feeding her and clothing her, giving her shelter, and that if she weren't there, she would be at the poorhouse. Bessie and Abbott are actually right. Had Jane not been looked after by Mrs. Reed, as awful as her situation is at Gateshead, had she not been there, she very likely could have been in a situation where she would have been doing physical manual labor to, earn her keep. Seems pretty likely to me that she would have been hired out to work in a textile factory, working with fabric at that point. But that would have been pretty dangerous. The timing of this is a little bit off because the Industrial Revolution, depending on when this is actually set, might not correspond exactly. We should give around 1840 as the time of the Industrial Revolution in England. And, the exact dates of when this novel is supposed to be set are usually guesses by scholars. But to give you an idea, in 1833, legislation was passed in Parliament in Britain that restricted children's work hours to 10 hours a day. So before 1833, children were able to work more than 10 hours in a single day. In 1856, less than a decade after the novel was published, remember it was published in 1847, it was still legal for a child to work 60 hours a week. And if a child was working as a ward of the state, as part of basically the really bad equivalent of welfare programming, she very well could have been doing physical labor. So her situation could have potentially been even worse than it actually was. So that's something I want us to talk about in class. Not at all to excuse Mrs. Reed's behavior or her cousin's behavior, because it's awful. But the fact that Mrs. Reed probably truly believed she was doing Jane Eyre a huge favor, and that she was right to some degree. Child labor was made really famous in Charles Dickens's novel, David Copperfield, in case that's anything you had read in high school. At 8 years old, Charles Dickens, who was a contemporary of Charlotte Bronte's, was working in a pot blacking factory in England, and made that famous in his fictionalized autobiography of his childhood in David Copperfield. So those are the main things I want to say to give you some background on the novel. If you are struggling with the language, it's okay. You will get a little bit more used to it with time, and it is 100% okay with me if you want to, look at the Spark Notes to get a sense of the plot and what happens in the chapters that are assigned, either before or after you read them, so that you can maybe have a bit of an edge when you actually go in to look at the language. The plot is really just the first part of what it is we're concerned about in class. We want to have a basic understanding of just what's happening, so that we can really delve into a lot more detail into examining Jane's character, her psychological motivations, all the more exciting things that we can talk about other than simply what happened. All right, I wanted this video to be 10 minutes. It's already at 15. But I hope this will provide you with helpful context to be able to read the novel well and respond well to it for your first Flipgrid video if you are in Group 1. Thanks for listening, and I will see you on Tuesday.